The impact that Howard has on the community. It has to be his ability to reach beyond the confines of his own organization and affect the entire community.
Howard has had a tremendous impact in welcoming and celebrating our diversity and in making that diversity actually be a strength rather than something that separates us.
He's an incredible leader. He's incredibly inclusive. He's got a huge heart, a strong mind, and a lot of grit.
Howard Tevlowitz was born on September 18, 1954. He was the oldest son of Stephen and Judith Jarofsky Tevlowitz, a younger brother, Stephen, 18 months his junior.
Kingston was home and stability. It was a small town in upstate New York, the first capital of New York State, by the way, that was burned down by the British, I think, and on the Hudson River.
His father was a hard-working man whose focus was on his work.
Father was a mechanic, worked for Exxon, and he worked very long hours. He was a very hands-off father because he worked so many hours.
His mother was an educated woman with strong family roots.
My mother was a teacher. She went to University of Albany, at a time when women really didn't get education, so my mother was a bit ahead of her time. She was born in the Bronx. Grew up with my grandparents, and my grandfather was sick at some point in time and needed to get to the country, and the country they settled in was Kingston, New York.
In Kingston, his mother's parents opened a five and dime. Howard would spend many hours at their store.
Everybody worked there. Me, my brother, my two cousins, there was my aunt's daughters. We're all the same age. So it was part of the family business. You dealt with the newspapers, you talked to everybody. I know who smoked what, I know who didn't smoke what, I knew, you knew everything. It was like the town center. Everybody stopped there. You got your newspaper, you got your lottery tickets, you got your cigarettes, you got whatever you got, and you left. So yeah, it was a lot of fun because, again, my grandparents owned it, then my aunt and uncle took it over. So from the time I could remember, I was either there hanging out, around my house hanging out, or with my grandparents in Fallsburg hanging out with my other side of my cousins.
His father's parents had a small bungalow hotel in the Catskills, where Howard would often visit.
My grandmother had a wood-burning stove. She was kosher. So she had the cholent sitting on the wood-burning stove. She had carp swimming in the bathtub, and she got progressively smaller as I got taller. And again, it was like stepping back into Poland, 1800s, going back there. It was unbelievable.
Kingston was an idyllic small town which provided Howard and his brother the opportunity to enjoy the outdoors throughout the season.
We had a park behind our house. Like when you walked out of the house, there was a park back there. Park with swings, a park with a hill, a park with all kinds of stuff you could go play with. You could get out, you could ride your bike, you could get around. Parents never worried where the kids were going because there was no place for them to get in any trouble, and there was nobody around there to find trouble.
Howard went to elementary school at Mayhair Elementary. It was close enough for him to walk the mile to school each day.
The street the school was on was a cobblestone street. How many cobblestone streets are on a hill? So you could imagine trying to walk down the hill in the wintertime and then walk up the hill in the wintertime, because they never bothered taking care of the sidewalks, so you had to walk on a cobblestone street.
He was a good student. His family placed a strong importance on education.
So my grandfather, my mother's father, came from Russia and came from a kind of a shtetl in Russia where they were very much into education. So I think it got passed down from my mother, or from my grandfather to my mother, and I think the love of Judaism and the love of learning came pretty much right from that direction.
Howard's family was one of the few Jewish families in Kingston.
We were a real minority. I grew up in a part of Kingston where there was nobody Jewish. There were just 4 of us in the neighborhood. There might have been a couple of thousand Jewish people in my town. It was very small. Look, we were always aware of it. Because my grandparents in South Fallsburg were kosher, they were religious. My grandparents growing up next door weren't kosher, weren't religious, but they were very Jewish. So I grew up in a very Hamish Jewish environment where religion was kind of pushed on you. and it wasn't exactly something I enjoyed. So I got bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox shul. My brother then got bar mitzvahed in a conservative shul, and I can't tell you that it was something that either one of us really overly were thrilled with.
Howard was first introduced to politics as a very young boy when he met the President of the United States.
As 5 years old, I actually went to a John F. Kennedy rally at Hyde Park, New York, where I was one of the kids he picked up.
His grandparents on both sides had immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe. Many of their family members had experienced the atrocities of the Holocaust, yet it was unspoken in their home.
The Holocaust was always there. I didn't have a lot of family members who survived it, so it's not like I had people I could see with numbers on their arms. They were always around me. When I grew up, one of my teachers was a survivor. So it was always there in the back, and we always knew it. But it's not like what it is today. There were no museums at that point in time. A lot of people were embarrassed by it. They didn't talk that much about it. It was just kind of there.
Howard attended Kingston High School, where he continued to do well in school. His mother taught at the school, and while he did not have her as a teacher, it brought him challenges as a young student.
So you could only imagine being not in a big high school with your mother as a teacher. Not exactly something that, I look forward to every day, and she was a strict teacher. Teachers were teachers in the 60s and 70s, so they weren't exactly open-minded conversationalists. That was no fun. Didn't enjoy that.
In high school, Howard played clarinet in the band, sang in the choir, and played baseball. Howard became aware of the social issues and prejudices that were a part of the changing culture. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and presidential hopeful Bobby Kennedy, along with images of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, brought the reality of the world into his living room all too clearly.
Our grandparents grew up not having civil rights, so it was very close to them what was happening in the black community, what was happening with our government. So it was something that was definitely on the forefront, more with my mother, and definitely in schools that I was at.
Howard would find one of the most impactful events upon him during the era was to take place a world away, when in the spring of 1967, following close to a decade of relative calm, Israel found itself poised for war against 4 of its Arab neighbors. On May 15, 1967, Israel was celebrating its Independence Day, when the Israeli government received word that Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was moving heavy artillery into the Sinai Desert. The Egyptian government had put its army on alert for an upcoming war. According to all the military analysts and pundits, it was to be a lopsided match. The Israeli Defense Forces consisted of 275,000 troops, compared to the 456,000 soldiers of the combined Iraqi, Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian armies. Approximately 250,000 troops, more than 2,000 tanks, and 700 aircraft ringed Israel.
You couldn't go to shul without it being in your face. Don't forget it was 19 years after the Holocaust. Most of my family didn't make it out. It was something that impacted me because at that point in time, those first few days, nobody knew. Again, I was 13 years old, but I remember being in synagogue. I remember how people were reacting. But I also remember the one thing that struck me, that I think that's to me this day, that they prayed.
On June 5th, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. By 7:30 a.m., 200 Israeli Air Force planes were in the air, heading towards Egyptian air bases. That morning, with the element of surprise in their favor, the Israeli Air Force obliterated 6 Egyptian airfields, destroying 204 Egyptian planes, half of their air force. Though Egypt had sufficient anti-aircraft ammunition to destroy all the attacking Israeli planes, miraculously, no order was given for these missiles to be launched. The Israelis accomplished their mission with practically no resistance. The total air superiority achieved on the first day of the war drastically reduced the enemy's combat abilities. Over the next 5 days, under the leadership of Prime Minister Golda Meir and Israeli General Moshe Dayan, the Israeli military overpowered the Arab forces. In 6 days, Israel gained control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Desert from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. It would become known as the Six-Day War.
And 67 was a miracle, and it spoke to a lot of us, me in particular, about myself. At that point, you were looking at yourself vis-a-vis your age, your draft status, pro-war, anti-war. The Israel piece was an important part of who I was at that point in time.
A few years later, in 1972, Howard graduated from Kingston High School magna cum laude. Upon graduation, he attended Tulane University for a year and then transferred to Brandeis in his second year, where he majored in anthropology and Judaic studies.
Brandeis was much more of a cerebral school, less blue book exams, more thinking, writing, and gave me an opportunity to actually learn to think, not just learn to study and to spit out an answer.
In 1975, while at Brandeis, Howard had an opportunity to become part of a program studying in Israel. It was a life-changing experience.
I lived in a neighborhood in Israel called Rehavia. Gorgeous neighborhood around the corner from a school that Brandeis owned in this neighborhood. And I was there for a year. It was an incredible experience for me just to be on my own with a group of people I really liked, and to really explore a country and to explore kind of where it came from.
Upon graduation from Brandeis, at his parents' urging, Howard spent a year as an intern in Washington, D.C., with Congressman Hamilton Fish Jr. He then began a program at the University of Florida to obtain his master's and doctorate degree.
Into my second year, when I was finishing my master's degree and I was teaching, I knew that A, I didn't want to teach, B, I didn't want to get past my master's degree, and C, I wanted to get out of the country.
Howard was determined to return to Israel.
I did some research and I looked for a program called an Aliyah program called WUJIS, the World Union of Jewish Students. And I came upon a program in a place called Arad, Israel, which is in the desert between Beersheba and the Dead Sea, or Masada. And I wanted to make Aliyah. I wanted to move to Israel. And this was the program. A, could help me learn Hebrew, and B, help me find a job when I finished. So I had the pleasure of living in Arad, which is in the middle of nowhere, for I think maybe 6 months. It was a great time.
While in Israel, Howard and his fellow students had an opportunity to experience an historic moment up close when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat arrived in Israel for an important meeting with Menachem Begin.
We, as a joke with my group, kind of got a thing that said press, and we went down to an Air Force base in southern Israel where Sadat was flying into Israel. We actually got on the base using this ridiculous button. You think of all the security in the Middle East where you have Anwar Sadat flying into Israel, you have Israeli leadership, American leadership there, and we actually got to watch him land, the shaking of hands. So I can't say that was as close, to shake his hand. We're a little bit farther away, but we actually got to see a part of history. That was an incredible thing to watch.
With poor economic conditions in Israel, Howard decided he could better serve the young nation by returning to the United States. He went to work raising money for the country through Israel Bonds in Buffalo, New York.
Israel bonds are technically securities, so you're selling bonds to individuals, insurance companies, to unions, to governments, to banks. On the other hand, it's an emotional investment. And we understood that it's partially fundraising and it's partially sales. So I lived in Buffalo, but I worked in Syracuse, and I commuted in the winter from Buffalo, bypass Rochester, to Syracuse, and north and south of Syracuse.
While in Buffalo, Howard met a young woman who would change his life.
I decided to go to a Jewish singles event in a Reformed congregation in downtown Buffalo. I think it was on Delaware Avenue, and I just popped in. It's just a fluke. Nothing else to do, so that's what I did.
It was always the same guys that were there every single time, but we were all, the girlfriends were friends, and it was fun. So we walk in and I see Howard there, and an unfamiliar face, which was very pleasant. And I said to somebody else there, like, who is that? And the person said, oh, that's Howard Tevlowitz, he's with Israel Bonds. But he's only here for a short time, he's moving soon. And I went, yep, story of my life. That was it. He never took my number, but I had a dentist appointment on that Monday in his building, actually. And he said, oh, just stop by when you finish the dentist appointment. So I did, I stopped in, he walked me back to my office, which was, I worked for US Customs for the federal government. And he gave me his business card, and I'm thinking to myself, what are you giving me your business card for? I'm not calling you. And I said, well, then I'll give you my business card. And I gave it to him, and he called, and the rest is history.
I lived in Tonawanda, and she lived in Williamsville. You know, these are really big areas of suburban Buffalo. And we kind of got together.
Neither one of us was very young. You know, we kind of knew what we wanted, and we just really fell head over heels in love with each other.
It wasn't like we were kids. So I think there was a realization pretty early on that that would be it.
They were married on January 5th, 1986 in West Palm Beach, Florida.
It was a small wedding. My parents would not fly, so we figured if we're going to get married in Buffalo, where we lived, we'd have to wait until June.
A couple weeks before that, Buffalo started with the storms, and we were supposed to fly out of Buffalo to West Palm. I don't know how many feet of snow we had at that point in time. There was no way to get out of Buffalo.
We finally had to take a train to Albany. His parents picked us up in Albany, and we flew out of Albany to West Palm Beach, where my parents lived.
Upon return from their honeymoon, they took up residence in New Jersey. Bryna worked in New York at the World Trade Center, and Howard had a job with B'nai B'rith for a short time, and then returned to work for Israel Bonds.
I worked in Lower Manhattan in the Brooklyn office. So we lived in North Brunswick, New Jersey. Bryna commuted into the World Trade Center. She worked for the federal government. And I commuted either by driving into the city, into Brooklyn from New Jersey, or I went into the city by train, and then I made my way out to Brooklyn from Lower Manhattan. A lot of fun. And by the way, you know, within a month after we got married, Bryna was pregnant. So we moved to New Jersey, whole world started.
Their son Aaron was born on November 8, 1986. Shortly after, Howard was offered a position in Sarasota.
It was a great opportunity. It gave Bryna an opportunity to be home with Aaron. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of like open up with the job. So we were based in Sarasota for about 6 months. My job was to cover Florida from Cape Canaveral up through Jacksonville, down through Orlando, over to Tampa, down to Sarasota, down to Naples. So we're talking a lot of running around.
After spending 6 months in Sarasota, he was asked to open an office in Orlando. While Orlando was a better fit for the young family, Howard found he wanted to be involved with people on a more personal level, without as much traveling. In 1988, he applied for a job in young leadership with the Jewish Federation in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
My job was to work with people, you know, under the age of 40. I was one of them. And I primarily worked with guys. Minneapolis was a great sports town. At that point, the Twins were there, the Vikings were there. At that point, it was the North Stars and the basketball. Timberwolves had just started. So, may not have a lot of Jews on the teams, but they owned them. So it was actually a great place to actually experience that. And even better, before there was a WWE or WWF, that's where wrestling came from. So on Friday nights with the boys and with the kids, what are you going to do? Well, I wasn't going to go to synagogue. I went to wrestling.
In Minneapolis, their daughter Jana was born on July 28, 1990.
He's always been really a hands-on dad. He listens, he gives opinions. The kids always say how lucky they are to have him, and my son just recently said that I hope I'm half the man that dad is when I have children.
While they loved Minneapolis, Howard wanted to run a campaign as a fundraiser and in 1992 accepted a position in Long Beach, California. In 1995, they made the move to Philadelphia, which opened new opportunities and challenges for Howard.
An office in Center City, which is in the center of Philadelphia, an office in Montgomery County called Bucksmont, an office in Bucks County, which is north of Philadelphia, and ultimately had two more offices, one in Delaware County, which is south of Philadelphia, and Chester County, which is a little bit out in the sticks. It was a great learning opportunity. There were no agencies. Philadelphia had 20-something Jewish agencies, all in Northeast Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, and in the main line of Philadelphia. None where I worked. And I needed to learn with partners. So I had office staff in each of the offices, and I did the overall planning for the fundraising. I did the overall planning for service delivery and engagement. And it was really where I learned to work.
In 2001, Howard was contacted by the National Office of the Jewish Federation about an executive directorship opening in Sarasota.
I came on the interview and it was interesting. I'd gone through a lot before I came here. I didn't know what I didn't know, and that's usually the best way to go into a job, of not having a full understanding of all the nuances and issues that were going on. I interviewed and I got the job.
Howard moved to Sarasota in June of 2001 by himself. The family was to follow him shortly. However, their lives were suddenly altered.
Literally a month after I moved here, Brian was diagnosed with breast cancer. And at that point in time, kind of everything stopped. You know, I'm lucky in the world I work in where we're very connected, and I was able to come home to Philadelphia. One of my friends was a doctor. We found a surgeon and we dealt with what we had to deal with, but our plans were off. Selling the house was off. Everything was off.
The stress was increased when on September 11, 2001, radical Islamic terrorists flew 2 airplanes into the World Trade Center in New York City, destroying the towers and killing over 3,000 innocent souls.
I was out in St. Armand's Circle at a meeting. I'm watching what was going on TV. Brian is home with the kids. George Bush was here, so we were dealing with some of the security stuff going on. And then everything stops. My wife had worked in the World Trade Center, so we knew people there. It was horrible. It was a horrible feeling. It was a horrible experience. And again, here in Sarasota, my wife is sick up in Philadelphia, dealing with 2 kids who are, you know, affected by what they're watching on TV. How couldn't you be? I couldn't leave. No flights.
Bryna ultimately recovered and is today a cancer survivor. The family moved to Sarasota, and Howard became entrenched in his work at the Jewish Federation.
He knows the importance of the synagogue with the soul of the community, and he knows that the Federation has a very, very special role with synagogues, and he knows what that role is, to support, to get our advice, to give us advice. And this has made a tremendous difference in our community.
Well, Howard has been a true visionary with regard to how the Jewish community has assimilated and incorporated itself into the community at large. He's had programming and outreach and missions in his heart with the interfaith community and with the cultural community and the educational community here in Sarasota. And it's become one big seamless community with regard to how we now operate outside of the box.
We moved from an allocations model of giving money away to multiple organizations to a granting model based on the kind of outcomes we wanted to see. So it was more people-based, not organizational-based. And we moved from a fundraising model that was volunteer-driven to more of a professional-based model where we were out working with volunteer leaders.
Most organizations seek to support themselves and their own philosophies. But what was so wonderful about Howard was he came to support the principles of other organizations, not just Florida Studio Theater, the Symphony, Embracing Our Differences, and many others. And those principles were shared principles in our community, principles that the Federation believed in, that he personally believed in, that would make better citizens and better human beings.
I'm going to give my good friend Michael Shelton his props. Probably 2006, 2007, Michael reached out to me to do some work with a not-for-profit he was working with at the time to bring Jewish out to the community, not to make people come to us. And that was an eye-opening experience that you could actually do Israel out in the community. We didn't need to make people come to our campus, to the JCC at that point in time. We could be out in the community, and that really opened up our world, whether it was Sarasota Ballet, the Van Wezel, Embracing Our Differences, it started at that point in time, Florida Studio Theater, the Oslo. We're working with them all.
During his tenure, Howard has never lost his passion for Israel.
Howard believes in building community through relationships, and his organization took 39 of the Ministerial Association to the Holy Land of Israel. Howard didn't show us the Holy Land, he showed us the people of Israel. It's uniquely different visiting the country, the nation of Israel and its people, rather than going from holy spot to holy spot, which we did. It was unique in the sense that it grew what I have in my genes, and that is a love and passion for the nation of Israel.
He has a passion for Israel, and he understands the importance of Medinat Yisrael to the Jewish community, especially in view of our history. To have a place that is a Jewish country where Jews can go. He will speak up on behalf of all of the issues that relate to Israel. He is an avid Zionist.
I love Israel, straight up. I'm a Zionist. I love the state of Israel. I love being there. I love going there. And I feel alive with a drumbeat, unlike any other place I've ever been. My relationship to Israel is to the land, to the people. My relationship is not with the government.
We asked Howard Tevlowitz his advice for those who follow.
Active listening is an amazing thing. Working with organizations and people not like you. Hello, we're part of a world. You should be doing this every day. And civility. It's okay to talk to people you don't agree with. Just be nice. You don't have to yell. You don't have to scream to be heard. Don't be afraid of dealing with people not like you. Open yourself up to that.